Well, Andy, let's come to you, Andy, because you're based in Jakarta. We had the pleasure. Well, I had the pleasure of meeting you a couple of weeks ago. Mott
Yep.
McDonald in Jakarta. You've been there. You're the lead on the water infrastructure. Jakarta and well, Indonesia in general, of course, is a country, the fourth. I think it's the fourth or the fifth largest economy in the world right now. It has 280 million people, something like that. Massive place, an incredible amount of challenges, national level challenges. Um,
Yes.
so feel free to come in and introduce yourself, and then maybe just riff off some of the things Emma's spoken about how good are we at just modeling and understanding the environment we're living in and sort of getting ready for that. But over to you, sir.
So yeah, thank you, Emma, David, and I think previously. I think I agree with all of the concerns and the new trend being observed by all the speakers so far. We're also observing the same shift in terms of, how do you approach developing a low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure, and I might also add inclusive. And I noticed that the UK government, UK CDO, Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, who we work quite a lot with over here, does prioritize the systems approach, the integrated approach in infrastructure planning and development. But in terms of climate resilience, a lot of the stakeholders or clients or government asset owners and project owners do not fully understand um, the details of what the vision that the leaders might have. So Indonesia as a country, like David says, has got a good vision of having net zero by 2045, climate resilient infrastructure by 2045 for the new capital city, 2060 for the rest of Indonesia. But a lot of the plans also involve things like access to um, you know, clean sanitation, access to climate resilient infrastructure by 2030. Uh, a lot of the high levels have been accepted by the senior leadership of the ministries or the president himself, but then how to get there is a bit difficult for us to define. And so the likes of Institute of Strategic Risk Management and others can help define how we can get there, especially with the stakeholders here in Indonesia. Because in Indonesia, maybe people in Jakarta, by means of the ministry or the Jakarta provincial government or the Jakarta local government, may have a better understanding of what's needed compared to the rest of the 31, 33 provinces. And uh, everybody has a different sort of climate emergency. Some cities may be dealing more with rising sea levels. The north of Java is sinking because of people using over extracting of groundwater for water supply and other usage. So I think Jakarta, for example, sinks at about potentially up to 20 centimeters per year, between 11 to 20 centimeters per year. So if we design from an engineering perspective a giant seawall and a pumping system, it what use does it have if the whole infrastructure sinks, if the whole wall sinks at the end of the day? So acknowledging and understanding of what the key issues are is going to be important for us engineers and risk managers to define. And we find that a lot of the international development clients, including UKFCDO, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Australia, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, they have specific um, assessments that needs to be enhanced as part of a consultancy firm's sort of activities to include climate resilience assessment. So, for example, for one of the projects that I'm leading, where McDonald's leading for a city in South Sumatra for a citywide inclusive sanitation project, meaning providing um, sewer connections or reticulated sewer system for the whole of the city of population of about 700,000 people. We include three additional assessments. So that's climate resilience in terms of flood assessment, in terms of plant resilience, energy resilience, um, operational resilience of the treatment plant or the sewer network, and the sewer connections program. We also include greenhouse gases emissions reduction assessment. which is more of a low carbon aspect. But it does have climate adaptation and resilience in terms of reusing biogas from the treatment plant for renewable energy use, for example, for your plant energy resilience. And finally, we also conducted a resource recovery opportunity. So, how can we create circular economy from, say, uh, organic fertilizers? We need to create the market for organic fertilizers within the city, create sort of MOUs and partnerships with the traditional fertilizer producers there in South Sumatra. When we raise these issues to the Ministry of Public Works and Housing, they always say, uh, this is something that the sanitary sanitation department of Ministry of Public Works have done in Indonesia. So the first one that something like this was studied and conducted, and their question was, is there a proof of concept that we can already adopt before we rewrite the regulations? But we say to them, we need the regulations now so that we can create the market. So there is a chicken and an egg sort of conundrum that needs to be um, uh, assessed and decided by the policymakers. But from our perspective, I think the policy and the regulations needs to come in first before the industry can respond, and we can create a new market, emerging market on climate. So that's one example of how Mott MacDonald is working with many stakeholders here in Indonesia. And with specifically with the UK government, we're now working with the UK Foreign Commonwealth Development Office on a program called Green Cities and Infrastructure Program, i.e. my sort of like background here. And it's 8-year program. Potentially, we're going to be working with the UK government uh, at 3 levels of government. So national government, sub-national government in terms of provincial government, and also the local government at the local level. And many of the we have 3 main interventions, but many of the objectives is compliance with the 75% of international climate finance requirements. So a lot of the issues now is how do governments access climate financing? And in terms of climate financing, obviously, the more resilient, the more low carbon, the more inclusive solutions you propose, the better it is that you will receive access to all of these additional support financially. And we also help government in the National Planning and Development Agency, Bappenas, to also look at how do they prioritize national strategic projects going forward to take into account um, the considerations for climate resiliency, low carbon development, as well as inclusivity. And also provide climate smart solutions. So I think Kathy mentioned about the importance of technology. So a lot of the problems that we're currently facing is how do we actually monitor and evaluate and report on our greenhouse gases emissions in terms of embedded carbons that we use for our construction. What is the losses of water in terms of non-revenue water for water utility companies? What sort of losses in terms of chemical use. So the more data we have, the better it is for utility providers or asset owners and managers to manage their assets. So I think the importance of smart infrastructure, predictive um, capability for early warnings we find is very important for flood resilience, for flood risk assessment. The Bureau of Climatology, Geophysics, and Meteorology of Indonesia is now developing a tool called impact-based forecasting instead of weather forecasting. So if you have a weather event, you can forecast what is the impact of that particular event, how much damage it may cause to a particular community. So maybe I'll stop it around there because I'm interested in the discussions during the discussion sessions, but those are some of the flavors I can share with all of you on where I see the industry is going and how governments, how international funding agencies respond, and how the practitioners in the industry also respond. And just to close off, we actually are working with the Institution of Civil Engineers, Emma. We're working with Kerry Bobbins, Dr. Kerry Bobbins, and we're also working with the UK National Infrastructure Projects Authority on the Green Cities Infrastructure Program. So the institutions like ISRM, ICE, all these sort of UK expertise can participate onto the UK FCDO program and can help develop the capacities of countries like Indonesia to catch up to where UK is at the moment. Okay, thank you.
Andy, thanks for that fascinating oversight. I will ask you a question about something you mentioned, which is the planning cycle. And of
Yeah,
course, as Emma sort of alluded to, a lot of the projects that are in play now might have been in planning cycle 20 years ago in a
yeah.
different world, let's face it. Are you seeing an understanding of the fact that these long term national infrastructure planning cycles, which can be 10, 20 years, really need to be brought into much shorter times in order to have impacts in real ways on people's lives? And is one of the things that's happening localization? Are we seeing increased localization and ownership at the local level? You spoke about those three levels of government, but are we seeing ownership at the local level rather than the national level, supranational level? Because that just allows for much faster planning and implementation cycles.
All right. So I think in terms of the longer term planning, yes, Indonesia does work on sort of medium and long term planning. At the moment, the national and subnational government are working on the next 5 year development plans. So we call it the RPJMD or RPJMN. So basically national or subnational medium-term development plan, 5 year plan. The next one is going to be 2025 to 2029. And it's a good timing just before the 2030 Paris Agreement sort of national determined contributions kind of like stock take. But then we're also working on our next 20-year planning between 2025 to 2045, 2024. And there needs to be a major shift in terms of how we plan for our infrastructure in the medium and long term. Uh, for example, this year in March, the government announced the national strategic projects, including an offshore oil rig, which to me is a wrong approach for government to announce personally. But we do need to be able to influence how the key decision makers and policymakers rethink about priorities, and if they are serious, uh, if countries commit to the Paris Agreement, and so they need to be able to. And also, I think losses and damages is also something that's been discussed throughout many of the COP conferences. And climate adaptation measures needs to be more appropriately defined for in the medium and long term. In terms of the commitment from the local government, I noted that the Australian government, by the name of KIAT, the infrastructure alliance between Indonesia and Australia government, there was a 10-year climate facility which is ending in 2026. But what we noticed, the difference between what KIAT or the Australian government is doing compared to the likes of ADB and the World Bank is that when the ADB and the World Bank focuses a lot on the ministry level, for example, public works, Australian government focuses on the public works agency within the city government. So, but the difference in the realization is that it's more difficult to build the capacity of the local government because it's far behind the national government. So, in theory, it sounds good for us to work on the local level because they will be responsible for managing their assets. But many of the regulations are not adaptable to the current conditions. For example, a lot of the local governments here in Indonesia are not allowed to carry out multi-year contracts. They rely on annual budgeting, including for major infrastructure um, projects. So we were proud to be able to convince the one of the city governments to implement a multi-year contract, but it took a lot of advocacy, a lot of sort of inviting them to see what good infrastructure looks like in Australia, for example. It wasn't an easy journey. And then in terms of their commitment of allocating their subnational government budget for sewer construction, which is not as sexy as a waterfront or a toll road or something like that, it's difficult for us to convince them to allocate those types of budgets. But the good news is the same level of scrutiny is now being assessed by the UKFCDO. So when UKFCDO released the terms of reference with us. We work with them to basically help. The program is called Green Cities Infrastructure. It's not Green National Government Infrastructure Program. So green cities mean local government, city government needs to be responsible. So A lot of the interventions go back to piloting at the local level, ensuring that the local level government can obtain climate finance and be able to plan the infrastructure themselves. But it does need support from the likes of, ICE, Infrastructure Projects Authority, Transport for London, UK Crossrails, and others to help with how to realize the operators later on, or the planning agencies. Thanks.